Good to see everyone today. Thanks for being out here and joining us online. Thank you for joining us online if you're doing that. Today we are kickstarting a new series called Conviction Over Compromise. You know, it's sometimes difficult to really kind of figure out, as we're being pulled constantly in all these different directions, how we best can kind of live a life of faith, live, this kind of biblical worldview, live a way to follow Jesus consistently. And I think one of the best examples of that is Daniel, and how he could live in an environment where maybe not have been so easy to live out his faith, but he did it consistently and with integrity and faithfulness. And we're going to talk about a little bit about that over the next couple of weeks. Before we do that, I wanted to share a little story because this journey for my family, my wife and my 6-year-old son Jordan and I, coming to Portland, I believe probably started long before I even kind of picked up on the trail. You kind of probably makes sense, right? That God puts things in your life at different moments, and you have no idea what kind of the ultimate kind of plan and direction is. And somewhere along the line, you're like, yeah, I see what you're doing there. Okay. And I think, but for me, it started with some divinely timed conversations that I had with my friend Josh. My friend Josh has been and is currently really involved in church planting here in the Pacific Northwest. I met Josh at a conference. I was in Missouri. He was from Seattle. We met in Houston, like you do. And just, we started having some conversations, and every year we would meet together at the same conference and go to the same Waffle House, right? Yeah, the only times I go to Waffle House is with my friend Josh, right? It was college at like 2 a.m. and now with my friend Josh. Once a year in Houston. And we would have these conversations, and he'd be trying to be like, Jason, you should come to the Pacific Northwest and, do this and whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that'd be really kind of cool, and I'll pray about it, yada, yada, yada. And here we are, right? And here we are in Portland. But Josh is highly involved in church planting, but he's also partnering with an organization called Rescue Freedom, which is a nonprofit organization that raises support to fight human trafficking. In fact, it was founded in 2008. Since then, they've raised almost over $2 million to fight human trafficking around the world. And one of the ways, one of the main ways that they gather support is by sponsoring or having people join them on trips that they call Climb for Captives. They climb big mountains. And they invite a team of people to train, and you got to be trained to climb these mountains. Last weekend, they climbed Mount Hood. They've done this several times. And last weekend, though, was pretty interesting. It was something Josh had done a lot. He was taking another team up their final push to summit the mountain. They'd been there for a couple of days. They'd taken the final push up the mountain. Their energy is drained. They camped overnight to kind of take this final push. And as they were taking their final push, they saw what they said was a black dot sliding down the summit. In fact, if you see this picture right here, I know it's really tough to see up on the screen. You probably even hear there's a black dot right up here, and this black dot, which is a person, right, starts sliding all the way down the mountain. So a 31-year-old woman lost her footing, lost her ice axe, slid 900 feet, picking up speed, flipping, eventually crashing into this rocks and into a fumarole. And a fumarole, if you don't know, is a volcanic steam vent that emits poisonous sulfuric gas. So Josh and the other witnesses, as they're making their final trek up the mountain, the thing they've been pushing for, see this happening. And they just assumed that if the fall didn't kill her, the gas would. So they decided, you know what, we're not going to go up to the top today. We're going to go over there. And so they go and they're looking through something. They start calling out, and they described that she fell for almost 30 seconds in their estimation. Josh said that they were particularly in a very treacherous part of the climb here, known as let me get it right, the Hog's Back, where there's just like there's this ridge that runs through these rocks that you have to climb over to get to the summit. And so instead of finishing the adventure, they go to assist this woman. After calling out for a few minutes, they hear a small voice calling out of the darkness. They couldn't understand what was being said, but they knew that voice meant life. So they assembled this kind of elaborate pulley system, and they pulled her out of the rocks. And miraculously, she was airlifted out. She only had minor injuries and slept in her own bed that night. It's amazing to kind of see. I mean, this happens so close to home, and to Josh and his team, and probably to us even today, they described it as an insane series of miracles. That she was able to survive the fall, that she was able to survive the gas, that they were there with enough time and enough, and the resources to be able to get to her in time, and then have the ability to get her the help that she needed off the mountain. They never summited Mount Hood last weekend. It's crazy when you have a plan and you set out on an adventure and you're like, I'm going to accomplish this dream, and God maybe has another plan in mind. If they didn't push themselves to that point, who knows if the woman makes it out. I think the point that I wanted to talk about not only is because, it's such a cool story that, this series of events, this friend of mine who I've talked to, many times, who was a catalyst for us even dreaming and coming here to be part of Faith Journey, now climbs a mountain not too far away from us, has this experience. And to me, there's a lot of things where I believe that God has you right now in the right place where He wants you, and it may not even be about you at all. You could be there simply to save someone else. So that job, that adventure, that thing that you're working on, where you might be getting frustrated with, that thing that you're going, I don't understand the reasoning behind what I'm doing here. God, what do you? This is so hard. I accomplished this thing. What if it's about God's trying to use you to reach someone else? Now, I've seen this story all over the place. I've seen it on Instagram, I've seen it on Facebook, the news picked it up. It's everywhere, right? And so it's kind of cool to hear it from Josh and hear it from other aspects and other people on this team. But I've seen it all over social media. It's a kind of a highlight reel, right? If I was part of this climb, I would have been like posting like crazy too. Like, can you believe this? This is crazy. And that's kind of what we get a lot of times, our highlight reels on social media. We don't see the grind. We don't see what it takes to kind of go through. We don't see what happens behind the scenes. We see highlight reels because with a few taps of our fingers and a couple of swipes, we can watch video after video after video of high moments and low moments of the lives of public figures, celebrities, really anyone who has figured out how to create a social media account. We can figure it out. We can see it. High points, low points. We have unrestricted access to the glimpses of the lives of these people, and we can see them rise, and we can see them fall. We can see their success. We can see their disappointments. We can see them their influence every day. And sometimes what that does is it blinds us to the consistency, to the faithfulness, to the integrity that can be behind the scenes that we need in our life, especially when we think about what's about our spiritual, like celebrities, if you will. We see people's highlight reels. We don't know what happened behind the scenes. So today, the first topic that we're going to talk about is what's going on behind the scenes. What's going on behind the scenes? We're going to look over the next few weeks at the life of Daniel, because I think that if we look at behind the scenes of Daniel's life, we're going to see that there was a lot of highlight reels in his story. But there's also a lot going behind the scenes that I believe that we can learn from. So, as we kind of get started in this series, we're going to take a look at the very beginning of the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. We're going to do a lot of reading today. It'll be on the screen if you don't have anything with you. It says this in verse 1. It says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim, there we go, of Judah, and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. To select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said, make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge, good judgment, are suited to serve in the royal palace. And then train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. And the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were four of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. And the chief of staff renamed them these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. So, Daniel was a Jewish young man growing up in Israel during a time of King Judah, in the kingdom of Judah, King Jehoiakim, right? And he did not Jehoiakim did not walk in the ways of the Lord. And neither did the majority of Israelites. This was during a time where the king didn't walk in the ways of the Lord, probably set some decrees. Majority of Israelites kind of followed suit, didn't walk in the ways of the Lord. Daniel's being brought up to them. And so because of this, God allows the Israelites to be attacked and overtaken by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Daniel was brought up to Babylon when he was a teenager as a captive. He was made to enter into the king's service. And as a captive, he was given the chance, given the opportunity that not everyone was given. Kind of a silver lining in a pretty terrible situation. You're going to learn these things. You're going to have opportunities. He had an opportunity to make something of himself, even in captivity. So he was to spend 3 years learning about all things Babylon, its language, its traditions, its customs, its religion. His own name was changed to a name that was after the Babylonian god Bel. His 3 friends received new names as well. This was done intentionally in an attempt to erase the connection and all loyalty to their own heritage and ultimately to their God. See, Daniel wasn't a priest. He wasn't a rabbi. He wasn't a religious leader. His job was that of a government official, serving 3 different kings over the time period of all of the writings of the book of Daniel, in a nation that didn't acknowledge or worship the one true God. He served, he worked for, he was surrounded by people who day in and day out who did not believe in God. He was a godly man in an ungodly environment. And yet, he was continually surrounded by the pressure to conform. And if he could, if he would have done that, it would have been probably okay to the king. He probably would have welcomed that. But Daniel decided something differently. Daniel consistently chose conviction over compromise. He consistently chose conviction over compromise. In fact, as we keep reading, it says this. It says in verse 8, Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these acceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered you to eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the youths of your age, I'm afraid the king is going to have me killed. He's going to have me beheaded. But Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. Said, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, let's see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. So the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. In verse 17 says, God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. And when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. And whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. The question we are going to talk a little bit about for the remainder of our time today is this: how do I live out my faith in a hostile environment? How do I live out my faith in a hostile environment? There are times, Daniel's proven that he's being exiled into a land that was not his choosing. He was doing it in a place where he didn't really want to be. He was held captive, and he was made to do a specific job and to learn a specific thing, but yet he was doing it consistently choosing conviction over compromise. How do I live out my faith in a hostile environment? I think it's probably just as appropriate today as it was back in Daniel's time. I think we could apply what Daniel did in his life. I think we could almost do exactly what he was doing, learn from him, and I think it would work out well for you and me today. I think it's that important. So, the first thing I want to say is this: how do I live out my faith in a hostile environment? The first thing is remain faithful regardless of circumstances. Remain faithful regardless of your circumstances. Let me pause right here because I don't mean to be insensitive, because our circumstances are often complicated and difficult. But sometimes we have to take some of the realities in our life not so personally. God is not attacking you. God is not attacking you. Okay? Much of our circumstances, what we go through in life, is not this. So it's not something to take it so personal. Much of what happened in Daniel's life wasn't a personal attack on Daniel. It wasn't Daniel was disobedient to God, and therefore God is saying, well, okay, here's your punishment. I'm throwing you into captivity. It was a byproduct of the broken world around him. It was a byproduct of everything that was happening around him, and he just happened to be in the middle of it. God is not attacking you. Much of our circumstances is not so much personal, much like the story of Daniel. We have no reason to believe that Daniel had actually done anything wrong, but yet he was in this hostile environment. We have no reason to believe that he disobeyed God. It was a circumstance that resulted from the world in which he lived. And some of us have really just bummer situations. Some of us really have that. Some of us, or areas of hostility in our lives that seem unfair. More often than not, you didn't do anything to cause those situations. More often than not, you didn't do anything that you deserve to live in a hostile environment. Yet maybe you find yourself in one. Remaining faithful to God, even when life doesn't go how I want it to go, is key. Remaining faithful to God, even when life does not go how I want it or planned to go, often starts with us accepting that the realities are just those things around us. It's just how it is. And what differentiates us as believers, as followers of Jesus, should be how we respond in those tough times. In the midst of a new, unfamiliar, and ungodly environment, Daniel had choices to make. And he made an internal determination that he would remain faithful to God. In verse 8, flat out says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine that was given to him by the king. There was an inward resolve. There was an inward determination. Daniel resolved, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself, but to remain faithful to God. The moment in Daniel's life, this moment shows that he had already made the decision about what he was going to do. This wasn't an in the heat of the moment decision. This was a pre-decision choice that Daniel made. He had determined in his heart. He had purpose in his heart. He had resolved in his heart that he would not compromise, but he would stay true to his convictions. Living for God was not Daniel's preference, it was his conviction. It wasn't something that he just preferred to do when it was convenient to him. It was something that was so core in who he was that it just had it fleshed itself out in how he lived, the choices that he made, the decisions that he made. What's the difference between preferences and conviction? Preferences are often are what we want, what we hope for, but we can be talked out of it. Convictions are things that we have settled on and we have determined that we will hold no matter what the circumstance or the cost. Convictions are an informed set of values that we are committed to. Crisis moments are not when we develop our convictions, right? Crisis moments are what reveal our convictions. If Daniel had not already been someone who had been determined to follow God and to live with integrity, he could have easily not chosen God and integrity in this moment. He could have easily said, all right, I'm just going to kind of go with it. I guess, God, if you show up whenever you want to. But until then, I'm going to do this, I guess. So we need to remain faithful regardless of the circumstances. The second way how we live out our faith in a hostile environment is to practice integration. Practice integration. Daniel absolutely stood up for an important element of his faith, his commitment to clean food. He had resolve. He did not assimilate. However, he did not separate himself from this culture either. Daniel went through 3 years of Babylonian training and excelled at it. He was given a new name, probably a name that he didn't want. Right? Often, as followers of Jesus, we feel that we either have to separate or we have to assimilate. When we live in a hostile environment, the easy thing, the choice that we seem to have to make is that we either have to separate or we have to assimilate. Separate meaning I fully reject everything this world has to offer. I'm separating myself from it. I do not associate with people who don't agree with me or don't believe like me or don't, whatever. Or I'm moving to a place that has more people, that has a more shared worldview that I espouse. Extreme cases of religious separation include, all kinds of just legalistic rules and regulations that you have to follow in order to be different from the world in which you live. Daniel didn't separate from the world. He didn't detach himself from everything. He couldn't. He was in training. But he also didn't assimilate. Another option that we choose is we assimilate, right? The Bible is too difficult to apply to our time and to our culture and the way where we're at right now. There's so many gray areas. There's so many by the ways. And there's people that have said this in every time and in every culture. And what makes us think that we're so special now that we have to, we just got to kind of figure out a lane to drive in the middle of all of this. And look, let's just kind of take in what we can and then kind of just maybe God will leak out as we assimilate. Or let's just say Jesus was really, really good guy. And if people rather would not follow his call to obedience, that's all good. It's on them. I'm not here to say anything or push or talk about what we believe or anything like that. I'm just going to kind of let the chips fall where they may. So Timothy Keller, pastor in New York, said we need to avoid separating, we need to avoid assimilating, and we should embrace integrating. We should embrace integrating. Let's look at Daniel again. He takes on a new location, a new name, a new job, a new education, and yet he did not fully assimilate into his culture. He rejects the food from the king's table. He only eats vegetables and water for 3 years. He didn't reject all the city had to offer him. He took the training. He did the hard work of integrating. He learned the culture. He prayed for guidance. He brought along community. If you never ask where's the line, you probably have assimilated. If you insisted there must be exact rules, then you probably can become a separatist to a degree. Integration means doing the hard work of figuring out faith in this environment. How do I figure out faith? How do I live with conviction over compromise? I'm not going to fully assimilate, but I'm also not going to fully separate. But somehow I got to learn to put this together and live out a faith in today's environment where I can have hold of my convictions, but still have some influence. I can hold to my convictions, and not compromise, but still be part of what's happening here. Because God's kingdom is all about, why did he send Jesus into the world? To seek and save those who are lost. Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. That's what Jesus said. How are you going to reach the lost? How is the kingdom ever going to expand if we separate or if we fully assimilate? We have to figure out a way to live out our faith with conviction in the environment in which we're at. Daniel did everything. He learned everything about the culture, about the religion. He learned everything about the community that they were in. He was an expert at it. God's favor was upon him. He used him to interpret dreams and visions. They gave him and the other three guys just super wisdom and balanced judgment, 10 times more than the other king's advisors. It doesn't happen if they just separate fully. And it doesn't happen if they compromise fully. The gospel is that there's certainty in my God and there's flexibility in how I live it out. I'm saved by grace, so I have certainty, but I'm still a sinner. Saved by grace, but I'm still a sinner. I'm saved by grace, but I'm still a sinner. The kingdom is here, but it's also not yet. There's a mix of certainty and flexibility. Integration includes intentionality. We have to have intentionality. Having people around you who are not like you is key. It's important. Being a community of believers who will also keep you accountable and help you process out how to live out your faith. You need that. You need to be kept accountable. You need intentional community. So you need to be, have people around you who are not like you, but you also need to have people around you who are encouraging you, who are keeping you accountable, who are sharpening you, who are challenging you. It's easier to kind of fall into one of those extremes. But it's not the way of Jesus. Hostility pressures a reaction with either assimilation or separation. But the peace of Jesus actually helps us choose integration. God's presence in Daniel's life was not limited to being in Jerusalem. God's presence in Daniel's life was not just limited to the good times and the good moments in Daniel's life. Jesus' presence, or God's presence, had gone ahead of Daniel, and he was with Daniel in Babylon, just as he had been in Jerusalem. In the same way, God's presence is not for your life isn't just inside of a church building. He wants to go with you wherever you are. He wants to show up in the small moments of your life, just as much as in the big, important highlight reel type of moments of your life. And God actually wanted Daniel to flourish in Babylon. God spoke to the prophet who was a contemporary of Daniel by the name of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 29, in verse 4, he actually says this. It says, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase the number there and do not decrease. He goes on to say, and also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray for it. Pray to the Lord for it. Because if it prospers, you too will prosper. What he's saying there is grow where you're planted, Daniel. Pray for the city in which you live. Don't try to tear it down. Don't try to just kind of bash it all the time. I know that you may not agree with the full array of government regulations or anything like that, Daniel, but learn from it. Be a man of influence in it. Integrate in it, because I'm going to use you, Daniel, is what God's saying. Grow where you're planted. One way to see change is to see for you is for you to see it, is to be about it, is to bring it, is for you to start to bring it from within. We need to pray for our city. I don't think that this applies to Babylon. We need to pray for our city. Amen? We need to pray for our state. We need to pray for our country. We need to pray for our world. If Portland prospers, guess what? So will you. Instead of trying to take a wrecking ball, it's a lot of things that you may want to. Maybe pray for it. Maybe integrate in and bring the change from within. See how God uses you in those environments. You're not going to make the change by being a separatist. You're not going to make the change by fully assimilating and choosing compromise over conviction. But there is an opportunity if we integrate. Grow where you're planted. Daniel, stay where you are, man. Thrive there. Have kids. Teach them. Teach them to have faith and conviction just like you do. Eventually, you're going to win people. You're going to influence people. Eventually, you're going to begin to win people and have influence. Eventually, you're going to be able to make a difference right where you are. It's a slow grind, but you have to trust the process. Daniel kind of gets this. He says, okay, I'm going to trust God. I don't know why I'm here, but I'm going to do what I can to learn and to be able to influence and watch God at work. But I'm not going to compromise my convictions. The third way that we can live out our faith in a hostile environment is to choose to honor. Choose to honor. That's difficult. Sometimes when people upset us or don't believe like us or have different value system than us, it's easy to tear down. In fact, we live in a world right now where it is so commonplace to rip apart and tear apart. What if we chose to honor instead? And choosing to honor doesn't mean accepting or agreeing or validating or putting your stamp of approval on anything. It means I'm going to choose to honor people. Daniel was so quick to honor those around him consistently. His situation could have been just a cause for crankiness. Let's put it that way. I mean, just imagine yourself in that situation, right? You're living in one country, you're being overrun by another country, you're being taken into exile, you're being forced to do something for 3 years, you're basically in indentured servanthood, and you might not be optimistic about life in that moment. He was brought in like a slave, and here's what we might not know, and you might not know. He was a 14-year-old boy when he was brought into Babylon. He was 14 years old. 14-year-olds don't naturally choose to honor. Right? This is not a natural thing for 14-year-old boys to be like, you know what, I'm going to be so honoring right now. But Daniel does it. He goes through this process with dignity. In fact, in verse 8, he actually says that he asked permission from the chief guard. A lot of times, I love that verse because a lot of times we say, nope, I'm not going to do it. It doesn't line up with my value system. I'm just doing this the other way. Daniel, in a hostile environment, asked permission to do something different than what was being prescribed. And then when it was challenged, he said, can we do it for 10 days? Can we test it? And then you see. He had enough trust in God to say this is going to be okay. but he didn't just force his agenda or force his way into that, or just deny it and separate altogether. He said, can we do this? Can I ask your permission? Asking permission was an honoring question. It was choosing to honor. He doesn't behave defiantly for the sake of being rebellious or the sake of making a point. He honors his leaders. When he was given pushback, he recommends this very reasonable 10-day trial period before embarking on a 3-year commitment. And in doing so, he kept favor with those who had authority. He kept favor with those who had authority over him, and eventually favor of the king himself. When you encounter hostility to your faith, remain humble, remain gentle. Eventually, there may be something good that comes out of it. Learn to be creative to avoid total assimilation, because it will only broaden your influence. People who don't believe in Jesus, guess what? They're still dearly loved by God. They're still dearly loved by God. People who don't believe in Jesus, aren't themselves hostile. Sometimes it depends on the person, but as a group, as a whole, they are not. Often people who are hostile towards Christianity have a very reasonable situation that led them to it, or have an incredible misunderstanding of what it means to be really in conversation with someone who actually is a follower of Jesus. And when we burn bridges, we lose the opportunity to share the grace and the truth about God with others. We just lose it. We lose it. We can avoid assimilation. We can avoid separation while still retaining good relationships with those around us. And so Daniel gives us a great example of what it looks like to choose conviction over compromise while still maintaining a good rapport with the people around him. He didn't insist his way with self-righteous anger. He didn't, but rather he showed consideration for this official in the position that he was putting that official in. The official said, you know what? I fear for my boss, that if I don't do this, that he will have me killed. Daniel had compassion on him and said, you know what? I don't want to put that guy in that position, but hey, can we just do this? Here's a reasonable expectation. In other words, he handled it with grace and love. Daniel was able to take a firm stand without being a jerk. That's an art. That takes some real discernment, real faithfulness. How can I take a firm stand without coming off like a jerk? This quality and this ability to lead like this is what enabled Daniel to last through 3 different kings in Babylon. 3 different kings, 3 different administrations is what's broadened his ability to have influence in the lives of others, and it is possible to choose conviction over compromise. Just looking at Daniel's life, I see it's possible to choose conviction over compromise, even in heated situations, and do it in a way that doesn't burn bridges with those around us who don't know the Lord. Live out your convictions with humility. Don't wear them as a badge or parade them pridefully, but carry them deeply in your core and let others feel them when you're around. What was going on in Daniel's life behind the scenes and out in the spotlight that set him up the way to respond the way he did. This is what was happening behind the scenes. He was remaining faithful to God, no matter the circumstance. He was practicing integration. He was choosing to honor. His one allegiance was to God and God alone. Daniel didn't compromise his convictions. And God honored his commitment to that. And, in the same way, you and I have that responsibility to the Lord. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that you aren't going to be pressured into taking on the culture of Babylon as you live in it. They may try to change who you are, maybe try to change your name, they may try to remove anything that could keep you from being loyal to your people and to your God, but they can't take away what matters most: your faith in the Lord. No one can change your beliefs but you. No one can steal or remove your convictions but you. So, what are your convictions? That might be a topic for another talk. But what are they? What are the things in your life that you know to be true and that you will never back down from? Maybe you don't know how to verbalize them. Maybe you don't know, maybe you need to take some time and you need to write them down. But it's important. And really, I would encourage you to hold the conviction that Daniel held, which is, I'm going to be allegiant to God. I'm going to remain faithful to Him. Because we start to put out other things, that's kind of where it can get a little bit sloppy. Daniel remained faithful to God. He thrived in the environment that he was in. He chose to honor. And because of that, all those things are happening behind the scenes that he was deeply committed to. We see him being used over and over and over again in these big, big moments. Some of them are super famous, some of them not as much, but we're going to discover them over the next couple weeks. What God was doing in his life was all set up because of what God was doing behind the scenes in his life. Let me pray for you this morning. Father, as we look to what you've been doing in Daniel's life, I can't help but see some of the applications that I can apply to my own life in today's time, in today's environment. How I can live for you, I can live out my faith in an environment. It may not be as hostile as what Babylon was to Daniel, but in a way, it causes me to pause and think about what I need to apply, how I can remain faithful, how I can choose conviction over compromise, how I can remain faithful no matter what the circumstances, how I can practice integration and begin to influence people and begin to gain favor with others, even those who may not embrace the same values as I have. And that in the same way, I can choose to honor them instead of tear them down. God, I just pray that if you are speaking to us about the importance of cultivating integrity and faithfulness behind the scenes, maybe that's somebody here this morning that God is just speaking that, hey, I need to think about what's happening behind the scenes in my life. God, I pray that you challenge us with the idea of remaining faithful to you, even when life doesn't go as we want or plan. And God, I pray that you show us how to live uncompromisingly for you while still loving those around us who don't know the Lord. And God, today I just pray for those who may decide to come today and you know what? I have started to assimilate or started to separate. And God, I really want to follow you. Or maybe this is a day where you're saying, you know what, I want to follow you. I've never made this decision before, but I do want to follow. I think that there's a way that I can do that. And you're ready to make that decision. God, we just pray that you will just envelop us with your love, with your grace, as you do all of us. You teach us your ways. And as we remain faithful to you, we know that you will look out for us. We just thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.